Everybody, and welcome to the latest in the series of WALA, Worldwide Airport Lawyers Association webinars. I'm particularly fortunate today to have Peter Kisrch and Vivica Brown with us to talk about what we can learn from the USA's response to the pandemic and the way that the USA has dealt with it. Peter needs no introduction. He's a partner at Kaplan, Kisrch and Rockwell and has done airport and aviation law for a very long time, despite his youthful appearance. And Vivica Brown is the division chair, head of the group at the Atlanta, in the Atlanta local government, regional government, and deals with the airport. So has particularly got direct knowledge of how one of the world's busiest airports has dealt with the COVID-19 shutdown and the impacts of that. So if I can turn this over, I think, Peter, to you first to talk to us just a little bit about what's been happening. I mean, we've seen a lot of, sensational headlines, of course, in the press. The latest, I think, certainly in the UK, has been about American Airlines and the huge number of redundancies, the world's biggest airline by passenger numbers, enormous, eye-watering number of redundancies it's going to have to make. But perhaps if you can just sort of bring a little bit of realism to the table, and also just to start today's discussion off. So over to you.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. It's a pleasure for Vivica and me to appear here this morning to talk about the U.S. response to COVID-19. In a word, whatever the U.S. has done is probably not something to be admired or to be replicated elsewhere in the world, in part because there has been virtually no national response to COVID-19 in the aviation sector. As a result, each of the airport operators, each of the airlines, each of the concessionaires have come up with their own COVID-19 response. And in that respect, it is useful to see what is going on in the United States in the absence of clear national policy. I'm going to talk a lot about the bigger picture of what's going on in the United States. And Vivica, who is the senior lawyer for the largest airport in the United States, and I think Vivica, one of the largest or the second largest in the world at Atlanta, is going to talk about how Atlanta operationally has handled the COVID response issues. I'm going to start sharing my screen here with some slides. See if we can do this correctly. So what I want to do today is focus on 5 topics, but I'm going to move through them pretty quickly, and Vivica is going to interrupt me at a number of points. We're going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on the U.S. aviation sector, which is pretty well known. Spend a little bit of time on the legal framework for the U.S. airport's response. That is, what are the unique legal constraints that limit how airports can respond. Third, we're going to spend a fair amount of discussion on the initial response, that is how airports handled the massive shutdowns that came about in early 2020, and the economic consequences, how airports have handled their tenants and users and demands for economic reparations or demands for economic concessions. And finally, the period of time we're in today, which is the recovery, reassuring the public during the pandemic and reassuring the public that it is safe to fly. This is probably a graph that everyone has seen in most countries.
Peter, can I just jump in? Sorry, only because I omitted to say the best way to raise questions during Peter and Vivica's presentations is to put them into the chat function below on the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to raise all of them. Thank you, and apologies, Peter, for cutting across.
Not at all. Thank you, Alan. And feel free to interrupt me, Alan, if there are questions as we go along. We should keep this as a conversation, and Vivica and I are going to try to do that as well.
Thank
you. So this graph is probably the same people have seen in countries around the world. We saw about a 95% reduction in travel demand in late March and early April, and there has been some increase, but still it is pretty dramatic. So a couple of legal principles that I think are important to understand, particularly because of the unique nature of the legal structure in the United States. First of all, the sources and uses of all airport revenue are highly regulated by the federal government, by the Federal Aviation Administration. Most airports in the United States are publicly owned by local governments, state governments, cities, but they are regulated by the federal government. Point number two is the airports must operate as closed fiscal systems, meaning that all revenue that is earned on the airport must be spent on the airport. And this becomes a particularly important point when we're dealing with response to the pandemic and the limitations on what airports can and cannot spend money on with respect to public health, with respect to COVID response. Number three, airports are prohibited by regulation from subsidizing airlines. And this is an important point because, as Alan said at the beginning, the airlines in the United States, as they are worldwide, are hemorrhaging cash. They are needing to lay off and fire and surplus employees by the thousands or tens of thousands. And airports themselves cannot subsidize airlines to keep them operating. Next point is the aeronautical and non-aeronautical revenue must be carefully segregated. This sometimes is by regulation, and more often is by contractual arrangements between the airport and the airlines that operate at that airport. Next point is that airports are prohibited from closing without the approval of the federal government. This was a particularly important issue early on in the pandemic when traffic levels could not really justify keeping airports open. But the federal government would not allow any airports to close entirely. They can close individual concourses in a terminal. They can close portions of the airport, but they cannot close completely. The next to the last point is that similar aeronautical users must be treated similarly. That is, there's a statutory prohibition against unjust discrimination. And what that means is airports have to be very careful not to have a favorite airline or a favorite concessionaire to whom they provide relief and they don't provide to others. And navigating that for lawyers during the pandemic has been a particularly dicey issue because, of course, each individual business enterprise to some extent is different, but they have to be treated very similarly. And the final point, which is one that has caused a lot of dislocation and concern among airports, is very early on, the Federal Aviation Administration determined that airports cannot spend airport money on public health functions. And what is a public health function has been the subject of considerable legal debate over the course of the last several months. The basic principle that the FAA enunciated is that public health is a function for public health agencies, not for airports. And so airports cannot do things like screenings and other sorts of measures designed to ensure the health of the public, either for arriving passengers or for departing passengers. And that, needless to say, has limited what airports can do. So the initial response in the United States was probably, as it was elsewhere in the world, something of a scream. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And let's just look at one airport in particular. I'll turn it over to Vivica to talk about the numbers at Atlanta.
Yeah, so thank you all. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate Peter mentioning it to me, and I'm very grateful for WALA for having me. So the pre-COVID activity in Atlanta is actually the world's busiest passenger airport. There are some questions about operational in terms of the number of movements, the numbers of takeoffs and landings. Is probably with Chicago or other airports, but passenger airport Atlanta is it. Pre-COVID activity, we had a variety of systems that were running at peak capacity. We have a people mover that shuttles passengers for each of the 7 concourses in Atlanta. You may recall or know that Atlanta has a parallel concourse system and runway system. And so the APM system is a very important train system that moves passengers. Obviously, all the ground transportation were operating at peak, and the food and beverage, we've got about 348 concessions locations in the airport. We have parking lots that are about 30,000 parking spaces on airport. All of our escalators and elevator systems were moving forward. The roadway system was great. And then, of course, the processing by TSA and CBP was at peak. So we were averaging 2,500 flights per day with about 300,000 passengers per day. The average flights per day in April and May were 600. It was a shock to the system, with the passenger count average from March 24th to May 21st being about 9 to 10,000 passengers. So you can imagine the impact of those numbers on the system. Peter, let's take a look at the next slide. So there was a massive reduction in our systems in Atlanta. In fact, we had a plan to take down the system systematically. And so we had 3 checkpoints, only one is open. Today, only 1 checkpoint is open. The north and south checkpoints are closed. The main checkpoint is open. We're averaging about, I would say, about 18 to 20,000 people going through the checkpoint. Now, the checkpoint is our originating and destinating traffic. It is not the connecting traffic. And so total, we're today about 80,000 people total through the checkpoints. Our international checkpoint is much lower. Obviously, Atlanta is mostly a domestic connecting airport, probably with about 20 to 30% international travel, and we had to really streamline that checkpoint as well. The Central Passenger Terminal Complex, which is essentially the concourses, there were significant reduction in operations, so much so that Delta, which is the hub carrier in Atlanta, but we also have several other carriers such as American United and others, but there was so little activity on Concourse C, which is Southwest, and D, that there were closures on parts of the concourses. Literally, there were bollards placed because it was a safety issue. If there was no gates being used on the concourses, we didn't want passengers traveling and meandering in those areas, so we closed that. There were closed operations on T South, that was our business travelers. Concourse B is a Delta concourse, closed. Concourse C North, closed. And Concourse E was completely closed. There were massive reductions in concessions operations, so much so to this day, there are 300 closed concessions out of 348 concessions. We had to, turn off about 100 of the 300 escalator systems and elevator systems. The APM was suspended or reduced in the frequency of going back and forth. The rental car center, the escalators were turned off. 6 of the 48 systems were turned off. Our TNCs, so our pickups and drop-offs of your Ubers and your taxi, it was limited and it was moved to the north and south curb. Typically, we had those pickups happening off-site because it would just cause so much congestion on the roadway. The atrium was changed significantly. And the atrium is the middle part of pre-security, sort of where there's some concessions there, but it's sort of the meter greeter area of the airport, very close to the bag terminals, to the baggage carousels. And so we took out quite a bit of the seating in that airport and spaced it out in that area and spaced it out somewhat. We also had some issues of the residentially challenged kind of migrating into the atrium, and because they weren't social distancing and may have been more at risk for COVID, we had to take some very significant measures to try to keep people distanced as much as possible and hand out masks to those who would accept it. The parking system was consolidated and moved closer in, and the airfield, we had one of the runways closed for maintenance, and that was good because we had such a significant decrease in flights coming in daily.
And the last point, I think, Vivica is particularly important because a number of airports, not just Atlanta, use their decline in traffic for the purposes of airfield maintenance, either maintaining runways, replacing runways, or doing work that was planned for 2020 or 2021, but they could take advantage of the lower traffic levels. I want to go back, if I can, to a number that Vivica mentioned in the previous slide, that during the depth of the pandemic, Atlanta had 600 flights, but only 10,000 passengers, which if you do your quick calculation is about 16 or 17 passengers per flight.
Right.
The reason for that, it sounds very strange that that would be, that flights would continue to operate, but it is in large part a function of a federal law that was passed in late March called the CARES Act, or the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Among other provisions, the statute provided federal grant money and federal loan money to the airlines, but only if the airlines continued the service they had pre-pandemic to most destinations. There were some limitations and some restrictions on that. But as a result, a number of airlines in the United States, in order to take advantage of the grants from the federal government and the loans from the federal government, continued to operate flights that were either literally empty or almost empty, raising a number of interesting policy issues as to why they needed to continue to operate. At an airport like Atlanta, that meant that you had a lot of connecting traffic or aircraft that were coming through Atlanta with minimal number of passengers. For airports, the most important part of the CARES Act was a program that was designed to bolster short-term liquidity by providing $10 billion to the aviation sector, including $7.4 billion for commercial airports in particular. And this money was provided with relatively few regulatory requirements. That is, the money could be spent on any lawful purpose for which airports could spend money, consistent with the principles that I articulated earlier. This was a very important relief package for airports during a time when they were frankly hemorrhaging cash. They continued to have their expenses of operating the airport. They were closing down portions, as Vivica has described, but they still had personnel and other needs. And so the short-term liquidity provided by this statute was very important. The airports had to agree to restrictions on how many people they could furlough or lay off or fire if they took those funds from the federal government. And just to put the numbers in some sort of context, the amount of money that each airport received was based upon a very complicated formula, with Atlanta receiving the most at $339 billion, Los Angeles at $324 billion, and as you see on this chart, it goes down from there. There were some anomalies. Some small airports received a lot of money. Some large airports did not because of the way the formula was structured. But the basic principle was designed to ensure liquidity for airports during a time when their income was going down significantly. So that's where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. What did the federal government do? And interestingly, and certainly anybody who's been reading the press knows that the US federal government has been fairly passive in its response to the pandemic at a national level, and instead has allowed most of the reaction, most of the response to come from the local and state governments. This theme was true as well in the aviation sector. The Federal Aviation Administration, although they are the regulator of the airports, provided very little national direction. They provided some guidance, and all of the guidance came with a caveat that it was only guidance and should not be interpreted as binding law, which left a lot of airports from a legal perspective having to jump and try to figure out what the FAA might be saying, if the FAA were saying anything about how to spend money. The expenditure of money on public health was a good example, which was unprecedented. Airports had never before had to confront the issue of whether to spend money on public health. After all, airports can spend money on restrooms and on cleaning the terminal. Why can't they spend money on public health? And so the guidance from the FAA that said you may not spend money on public health was an illustration of the fact that airports had to play a bit of a game of catch up. So the FAA issued some guidance, some questions and answers, some recommendations on what relief airports should provide to their tenants. And in early July, the federal departments of Transportation, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security issued a report called Runway to Recovery, which was designed to be a set of guidance or best practices for everyone in the transportation sector, with a particular focus on airports. But like the previous guidance, it was only guidance, and it did not come with a legal screen on it as to how and where and under what terms and conditions airports could spend money on the COVID response. So airports had to develop their own response, whether it comes to face coverings or health screening or social distancing. And as Vivica will talk about in a moment, each airport figured out their own public outreach efforts to convince passengers and users to comply with various health requirements, in part because the actual local requirements differed state by state and county by county in the United States. So there were states, including the state of Georgia, where Atlanta is located, where face coverings were not mandated. And in fact, under state law in Georgia, Atlanta could not mandate face covering because the state did not mandate it. So as an illustration, the ability of airports to adjust was a function in part of what the local requirements were. So what were the airport responses? First, airports developed relief packages for their tenants and users. For the airlines, things like deferring and waiving rent, deferring and waiving landing fees, or extending or changing the term of the airline use and lease agreement. And these were done on an airport by airport basis. Some of the industry groups, including ACI, provided some advice to airports for what industry best practices were. But by and large, each airport decided their own policy and their own practice for how much and under what terms and conditions to waive or defer rent or landing fees. Same principles were applied to concessions. But as I mentioned early on, airports' ability to provide waivers or deferrals for concessionaires were different because these are non-aeronautical tenants and subject to a different set of legal requirements than are aeronautical tenants. So some of the concessions that were provided, including deferral or waiver of minimum annual guarantees, deferral or waiver of rent, allowing concessionaires to reduce the staffing or their hours of operation or their space requirements. And again, these were done on a concession by concession basis or airport by airport basis. As airports were putting together these relief packages, one of the issues they had to consider was the effect of bankruptcy and the likelihood that some or maybe many concessions or airlines would declare bankruptcy under US law before the end of the pandemic. And I'm not going to get in great detail here into bankruptcy, but under US law, the manner in which particular payments are waived or deferred is very significant, and whether or not an airport can ever recover fees or rent that's been deferred in the event of bankruptcy is of some question. In the airline sector in the US at least, bankruptcy has come to be viewed as a pretty standard business tool. That's not true worldwide, and it's not true throughout the United States economy. But there's some commentators who believe that before the pandemic is over, it is likely that some or all of the US airlines will declare bankruptcy and be restructured under the federal bankruptcy law. Among the carriers that are commonly thought of as likely to declare bankruptcy are American Airlines, the largest by passenger volume in the world. So in this context, Vivica, maybe you could talk about the recovery responses at Atlanta. I can play this video, or maybe you want to start by providing some context here.
Yeah, let me give a little context. So in Atlanta, Peter mentioned those variety of approaches to provide relief, and that the relief in the US is largely based on what is occurring in your state or your local government. Some of you may have heard that there was, with regard to masking, for example, there was, a direction issued by the CDC and I believe the World Health Organization with regard to protection of the community by masking. And so the mayor of the city of Atlanta, which is the sponsor of the airport, was interested in understanding whether or not she could issue a mandate for masking. And so we took a look at the executive order from the governor, and there was some specific language that said that governments could not be more or less restrictive. But then there was some cities, some outlier cities in the state of Georgia, Savannah, and some others who decided after so many weeks and the numbers were continuing to climb, that they would issue a mandate for masks within their jurisdiction. And so Mayor Bottoms followed suit. And thereafter, there was a lawsuit between the governor and the mayor in Georgia. And recently, I would say within the past couple of days, the governor has dropped that lawsuit. That lawsuit was dismissed. And so at this point, we have a mandate for masking, and that was one of the approaches that was taken, was to provide masks for airport users. And the airport has purchased a substantial number of PPE and volunteer and offers them. We haven't had an instance of having to cite someone for not wearing a mask. We believe the President of the United States was offered a mask when he arrived in Atlanta. I'm not sure whether he took us up on that offer, but certainly that offer was made. In addition to masking, obviously we've offered relief for the concessionaires. The concessionaires, as Peter mentioned, are non-aeronautical or primary non-aeronautical users in Atlanta. And we have recently offered a waiver, not a deferral, of their minimum annual guarantee rent. It will be effective essentially from mid-March until June of 2021. That's a very, in my opinion, a very robust waiver package. In addition, there are waiver of some parking fees for a certain number. Whomever is registered for parking, there's a waiver of support space fees. And there is a reduction based on employments for percentage rent as we move through this relief period. And certainly City Council may evaluate some additional relief, but that's where the relief is now for the concessionaires. With regard to the airlines, as Peter mentioned, we have agreed to defer payments from the airlines. The deferral is throughout the end of the year. They will pick up their payments, including their back payments, starting in January of 2021. And there is a payment plan, if you will, for the airlines to be able to make good on the amounts owed, and that will be paid over the course of, I believe, the first 3 quarters of 2021. And so there were lots of additional efforts taken to ensure social distancing and ensuring that passengers, it's a behavior, it's a psychology of the passenger. Obviously, we all know that, and it is not just limited to the airport structure itself, but it extends also to the airlines, to the concessionaires, to the parking attendants, having to do with cleanliness and just a sense of comfort in entering the building and being able to get on the aircraft. We also know that all the airlines are mandating masks. They have removed middle aisle seats in the aircraft. They've taken some substantial measures to help the industry bolster a sense of safety with regard to COVID. And this video is one that was created to advertise what is happening in the airport to ensure that employees as well as passengers feel safe.
Let me just play this brief video. Whoops. Sorry about that.
Hartsfield-Jackson Airport is safe, clean, and ready for you to enjoy your summer travel. It's recommended to wear a face mask at all times while at the airport. Look for decals on the floor to help you keep a safe distance of 6 feet or more. We've also placed 300 new touchless hand sanitizers throughout the airport. For more details about the new policies to make sure the airport is safe, clean, and ready when you are, go to atl.com/ATL Strong.
So I think that did you want to add a little more to that, Vivica?
No. I was just, I'm pleased with that. That was before, some changes, but please do, Peter.
I think in many respects, Vivica, what
I can jump in there quickly.
Yes.
I did read, apropos Delta Airlines, that chap who said he killed bin Laden, who's a big tweeter and an Instagrammer, Robert O'Neill, had refused to wear or wasn't wearing a mask on a Delta flight, and had tweeted, aggravated the situation by tweeting it, that he wasn't wearing a mask and saying that he wasn't a, bleep, and he wasn't going to wear a mask. And Delta have banned him. I don't know for how long, but I did see that, which was reassuring that they are presumably taking a zero tolerance approach to this kind of behavior.
Well, Alan, you raise a really good point, and I think it ties directly into the next slide, which is that in the United States, airlines have the authority to ban passengers from their aircraft based upon public health reasons. And that's the basis that Delta, I believe, Vivica, I think, has a list now of 250 people who are on their no-fly list for refusing to wear masks. Airport operators do not have that authority. And that's very important. So if the same gentleman had not worn his mask in the airport could not have prohibited him from getting on an airplane. And that is really one of the most difficult problems that airports have had in adjusting to the pandemic, because while they can either recommend masks or require masks, one of the penalties that they impose cannot be prohibition from flying. And that's where the airlines have stepped up, and each airline has over the course of the last several weeks adopted slightly different policies on mask usage, such that I think by now almost all airlines, maybe all the major airlines in the US now require masks. But there was a period of time when there was some real transition there. So the legal challenge for airports has been that as I mentioned early on, the FAA said that airports cannot spend airport money on public health. Airport operators cannot prohibit passengers from flying, and the public health functions are not a permissible use of airport revenue. Well, where does that put airports in the recovery principle? I mean, I don't have to tell you that the graph of recovery looks very different depending on which of the many forecasts you believe. But in any event, we're going to have a period during which air traffic will be significantly less than it is today, or than it was early this year, and the rate of growth depends upon whether you believe a pessimistic or an optimistic view of how traffic is going to recover. But what role do airports play in this effort? And I think we want to get to what the lessons are learned so far, and I think, Vivica, you'll probably have something you want to add here as well. Number one is that the absence of federal policy and regulations impaired the immediate responses of airports. That is, each airport had to figure out for themselves. Some of the industry groups like ACI of North America, ACI World, the American Association of Airport Executives, or AAAE, and a number of other industry groups stepped into the void to help airports coordinate with each other and figure out what would be best practices for immediate responses. Number two, the limited reliance on local resources made it particularly difficult for airports to figure out early on how they would protect the health of passengers. One good example that certainly made the press worldwide was the governor of the state of Florida wanted to prohibit passengers coming into the state of Florida from the state of New York. Though it seems like it was years ago, at that point, there were more cases of COVID-19 in New York than Florida, and Florida thought they could stop passengers getting off airplanes. Of course, from a number of legal perspectives, that was illegal and impermissible. but it set the tone, I think, of a lot of the responses, which is that the local governments were trying to step in where the federal government did not, to try to impose regulations to control the spread of the disease. Number two is ambiguous and inconsistent guidance that came out at the federal level really meant that for each airport, they had to engage in a complex legal risk assessment. Essentially, they had to decide how risk averse are they going to be to the potential legal consequences of either taking an aggressive action or a less aggressive action with respect to the public health in the terminal. And Vivica talked about the legal challenge between the governor of the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta as just one example, where the city had to decide whether or not it was going to violate the directives from the governor in order to increase public health in the city, and that resulted in litigation. So each airport had their own risk tolerance, and each airport decided how far they were willing to go. In addition, the concessionaires, who as non-aeronautical users did not receive the same kind of federal economic relief that the airlines and airports did, engaged in substantial lobbying at a local level to ensure that they could get some degree of relief from the airport itself. And of course, the amount of relief that an airport could give was largely a function of the airport's own economic condition and financial condition and how much resources they had. Finally, the CARES Act, which I mentioned early on, did provide some very substantial short-term relief in the months of April and May, June, and maybe even in July, but it did not address the financial impact or the multi-year financial impact that's going to happen to airports as their revenue declines, but their expenses continue. Vivica, did you want to add anything else about lessons learned, particularly at Atlanta, as you walk through this process?
There are so many on a variety of levels, both operationally, and one of the things I will say that we did immediately was engage with your firm, Peter, because we didn't have a national response. We had to rely upon a firm that has relationships that may be able to determine what the trends are and how the approaches are being taken. So with regard to concessionaires, we have an interest in ensuring that the concessions are ready for whenever we were guessing when this pandemic would pass. I don't think any of us had any idea that we would still be dealing with the pandemic now back in March, right? We thought, well, okay, a couple of months, it will be contained and we'll move forward. And so we were always focused on recovery and what can we do to ensure that when we recover, we're in good shape. So one of the lessons learned, I would say, and I think Atlanta does a pretty good job, is they immediately went into creating a resumption of operations plan, whatever that looked like, and they were flexible enough to keep modifying the plan. I know sometimes it's hard to plan when you have no idea what the future holds, but I would say one of the lessons learned is immediately you've got a takedown of operations and a resumption of operations plan that needs to be developed immediately across all spans of the business, including from your employee engagement all the way over to in the event that you've got airlines that are going to declare bankruptcy or may no longer service your city. So we started to evaluate that, but we did that a little bit later because we had the hair screaming moment in the beginning. I would also say, as a lesson learned operationally, is I think that Atlanta is doing a decent job right now with that, is involving the lawyers as part of your operations plan. Sometimes, we'll have silos, and I think we all experience this, where the business kind of thinks they do the business plan and the lawyers kind of get involved when the business thinks the lawyers should be involved. I think the lesson learned is there is a multidisciplinary group of individuals that gets together as part of the takedown of operations and the resumption of operations plan.
Viveka, I appreciate that not so subtle plea to please call the lawyers. That's I think that's appropriate. So what's next? And obviously we want to leave some time for questions here, but under the CARES Act, the airlines that received benefits were not allowed to make significant cuts before 30 September. And we are now literally 31 days from there. And we are seeing airlines announce significant cuts beginning 30 September. Number two, we're likely to see bankruptcy. There have been a number of car rental company bankruptcies. Some of the Latin American carriers have sought bankruptcy protection, Virgin Atlantic. It is likely we're going to see US carriers as well. There is talk about further congressional action. There's talk about Congress providing an additional $10 billion of relief. Congress is not particularly known for acting quickly. And so that, I think, is an open question. And the next real important step is providing clearer direction on the division of authority over health screening. The FAA, beyond saying that airports should not engage in public health functions, has provided no additional direction to airports on how they can conduct health screening, whether they can conduct health screening. And as a result, what you see is some airports that are being fairly aggressive and other airports that are not. So with that, Alan, I think we're happy to take questions, and Viveka will talk about the practicalities of this, and I can probably talk a little bit higher level about some of the principles.
That's super. Thank you. Thanks, Peter, and thank you, Viveka. We've got a number of questions have come in, which I'll ask, but I just wanted to go back to the point that Viveka made about the plan that Atlanta has. And I mean, Viveka, would I be correct in assuming that one has to envisage, I mean, we're seeing this in Europe, you know, this sort of ebb and flow of a spike and a contraction in an area. One has to sort of, you know, there's sort of the 300 of the 348 concessionaires still closed, that there's going to be a bit of an ebbing and flowing. So perhaps you know, more than one checkpoint will be opened up for a period, but then having the ability to, I don't know what you do, furlough, but there's no furlough scheme, of course, in the States, or I don't, you know, how do you deal with that? You know, sort of calling employees in, you know, you need a checkpoint for, let's say, the holiday, you know, the Thanksgiving holiday season, and then after that it contracts again, or there's a spike and the traffic tapers off. How does one deal with that? Because it seems very, very difficult.
Yeah, so the TSA controls the employees that work the checkpoint. And so, sort of as I mentioned, the collaboration between the agencies is absolutely critical. They have standing, and they're probably weekly now, they were daily. We were meeting daily, probably through all the way through the beginning of June. And because things were changing just so quickly, and kind of just talking about that. So we meet with our FSD for TSA, and there are projected passenger surges. So clearly we've got a surge coming for Labor Day, but that surge is nothing like the surge would have been pre-COVID. But we talk about the number of check lanes that are open. Sometimes I think we have opened the North Security check lane when, for example, it is determined there is a person who has screened through or is about to screen through with a fever or some symptoms. And then you got to close the security checkpoint to clean it and shuffle everyone over to another checkpoint. So there are various contingencies in the plan, and a collaboration with the federal agencies, both CBP and TSA, on how to move forward in terms of the operational options given any particular circumstance. But yes, it is very difficult. It is somewhat based on extrapolating the number of passengers based on the number of cases, the catchment area, and the particular holiday or seasonal push.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, so it's a collaboration and communication is vital. I've got some questions that have come in. Some of we've answered, I think, in the presentations. I've got one from Diego Gonzalez. Do you know if in the United States there have been any lawsuits against airport operators related to COVID due to the contagion of the disease or due to a faulty response to the health measures applied within the airport?
Not yet. I mean, not that we're aware of yet. Needless to say, we're worried about that. But as far as I know, Vivica, I don't know if you know of any, but I know of none yet.
I don't know of any yet, but I will say that there was a new law passed, Peter, in Georgia called the Georgia Safe Harbor Act. And what that act does is there is some very specific language that, and you know, the font size, the sign size, and all is dictated that essentially is a disclaimer for anyone entering into any particular facility, saying that they take their health, you know, they assume the risk. Now, whether or not Peter is probably someone that can answer this better than I can, but whether or not a sign in and of itself is enough, that's a question. But certainly in the state of Georgia, like, we are looking at encouraging the concessionaires to place these signs in their unit. We're going to place them in the airport in conspicuous places. We have a train that comes.
I think we've just lost.
I've walked into restaurants in Georgia, they're up already. So that's the only thing that may mitigate litigation with regard to COVID that I am aware of.
And Alan, I'll also mention that the U.S. Congress is considering legislation that would, on a broader basis, provide indemnity or exemption from litigation over COVID-19. That has been pursued pretty aggressively by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I don't have to tell you that the Trial Lawyers Association is not supportive of that.
No, indeed. The insurers are very supportive.
Yes, indeed.
It's a question from Bayo Arafianto. Does the FAA also approve the aeronautical and or non-aeronautical tariff before implementation? And does the health crisis, does this particular health crisis, is it likely to trigger airport operators implementing extraordinary tariff adjustments to speed up the recovery process post the pandemic?
Well, I think there are two different questions. First of all, the FAA does not approve aeronautical and non-aeronautical tariffs before implementation. This has been deregulated in the United States for the last 40 years. There are basic standards in terms of reasonableness and making sure that the fees are not unreasonable, and the principle that airports are closed fiscal systems keep airports from levying unreasonable tariffs. The second question is a much more difficult one, because here's the dilemma. The airports are experiencing increased costs on a per passenger or per tenant basis, but their tenants, the airlines and the concessionaires, are receiving less income. And so you would think that airports would in fact want to levy an extraordinary tariff or an additional charge because of their additional costs, but their tenants can't afford that. And we are right now in the midst of trying to figure that out. While in March, when we thought that the real effects of the pandemic would last 2, 3, 4, 5 months, it was less of a concern. Now that it looks like the effects on the aviation sector will certainly last to the end of the year, and most people believe well through 2021, a lot of airports are talking about extraordinary charges to deal with their additional costs. We will see.
A question from Margareta Rosetta about the passenger numbers in an aircraft. Is there a cap on capacity or passenger load?
No.
50%, and is there an FAA regulation related to this?
No. There has been some pressure on Congress to adopt such a regulation, But Congress has not adopted a statute. The FAA has not adopted any regulation. And so what you'll see is airline to airline, there's a fairly wide variation on how many passengers they'll put on airplanes.
And I think one of you mentioned removing the middle seat, actually physically removing.
No, they're not physically removing it. They're just not selling it. Yeah. And that varies. I mean, Southwest Airlines, one of the larger carriers, is not selling the middle seat. Delta Airlines is mostly probably not selling the middle seat. United Airlines is trying sometimes not to sell the middle seat. And each of them has their own standard for what that means.
And what is the uptick? Has there been an uptick in passenger numbers? I mean, we've seen in Europe, you know, a lot of people just saying, okay, I've had enough, I'm going somewhere.
But there has been, I mean, remember in much of Europe, trains offer an option to air travel. That's not true in the United States. And there has been a significant uptick. And if you look at things on percentage basis, at the bottom of the pandemic, nationwide, there were about 80,000 people flying. Today, there are 10 times that many at 800,000 people a day flying. But that compares to the normal day at this time of year of about 2.5 million. So it's been, in percentage terms, an extraordinary uptick. In terms of actual numbers, still pretty modest.
Wahuni Bahar, our friend in Malaysia, has asked a question. Considering this is not going to go away soon, do you expect any change in the policy of federal law in the years to come?
I'll try not to get into U.S. domestic politics, but I do not expect any change before January 20th of 2021. And depending upon the outcome of the November elections, there will either be no change or a significant change.
Okay. Farouz Isma, crystal clear presentation. Thank you very much, Farouz. With regards to airlines, are there any government policies that help them to survive besides waiving various fees and the CARES Act, of course? For example, allowing the passenger plane to become a cargo plane.
Yes, there are a couple of things. I mentioned the CARES Act and the grants and loans to airlines that have been very substantial and have been designed to keep airlines afloat through September 30th, which at the time people thought was plenty of time. When those expire and those loan programs expire, what will happen is anybody's guess, but we expect that there'll be some significant dislocation of the airlines. The federal government has allowed passenger planes to convert to cargo planes. They've been very flexible in adapting to how the aircraft are used. And cargo, not surprisingly, has not shown the kind of significant decline in activity that passengers have shown, in fact, an increase in activity. And so the federal government has been quite flexible in allowing airlines to change the configuration of their aircraft.
And then more of an observation from Juan Hutron. I believe it is clear that a better federal policy should be issued in accordance with international standards at the earliest possible opportunity, although you cannot predict how things will evolve. Well, I suppose, yes, that's right. Although what international standards are at the current stage in relation to COVID it's quite disparate, frankly.
Well, and to be perfectly blunt about it, the lack of federal response in the aviation sector mimics what's happening throughout the United States. And so the aviation sector is not an outlier in that respect in the absence of federal policy. Whether over time the federal government will begin to adopt a policy remains to be seen, but we are many months into a very serious problem, and it would take the federal government many months to develop and implement a federal policy. So I think a number of us are fairly pessimistic that we will get a federal policy before next year at some point, at which point we're really talking about economic recovery, not the public health issues.
Is it just sort of a question? How true, because obviously we're getting news here, we're picking stuff up, which is through the filter of whatever newspaper we read. But there seems to me to be a real tension. And when one thinks of the federal government, one thinks of Trump, the president, the White House, and when one thinks of the state, one thinks of the local guys. But there seems to me to be a real tension with the White House calling mayors fools in uppercase and sending in unrelated National Guards, but there doesn't seem to be as much sort of unity as one would hope for. Now, is that a fair observation, or is that not quite the way it works in practice? It's just.
I think it's not only a fair observation, but it's a little bit of a understatement. I think that Vivica can talk about the tensions between the governor of Georgia, who opposes, I think it's fair to say, Vivica, the governor of Georgia opposes mask mandates. And there are governors and mayors who not only support it, but have imposed it. The challenge that we have in the aviation sector, for reasons that may be very obvious, is that we have a national aviation system. The regulation of airlines and airports is at a national level, but the policy of the White House is to allow a local and state response to the pandemic. And there's almost an inherent conflict there, that we've got the governor of Georgia wanting to do one thing and the governor of Washington State wanting to do something different. And one of the challenges is how do we ensure the safety of the system when a passenger may get on an airplane in Georgia with very different health screening than a passenger who gets on an airplane in Washington State, and they both are going to Chicago. And now how does Chicago deal with passengers that may have different levels of health scrutiny? And that's a problem that airports are working through literally by the day as they try to figure out and press the federal government for more federal responses, so that Chicago, for example, can know that the passengers getting off an airplane have been screened at their origin at both of those cities. And Vivek, I don't know if you want to talk about the particular challenges you face in Atlanta and the conflicts with the governor.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly there, it's documented by the litigation that occurred between the differing viewpoints with our mayor and our governor in terms of mask mandates. I think the position was that certainly individuals have an option to wear a mask, and the local government response was, there's no option to wear a seatbelt. And in wearing a seatbelt, it's for the protection of not only the person wearing the belt, but for the person who is not wearing one in another vehicle. So I think that it's just a philosophical difference. But you have that issue, as well as just there seeming to be this approach of Georgia, I think just recently was identified as one of the places that you're most likely to get COVID, is either number 1 or 2 in the US. And so you have to applaud any approach to try to contain it. The other thing is, with regard to the airport, we are tracking the number of available hospital beds and cases on a regular basis. We call it a situation report, and it's prepared by the Emergency Command Center at the airport, because we believe that there is a correlation between those instances and passenger travel, as well as what activity needs to occur as much as we can in the airport. One of the things that Atlanta has done is allowed the state and one of the other neighboring counties to create a COVID testing center by using airport property. There's no airport funding involved, but using airport property, and there are upwards of 800 tests a day being done at that site. It's extended now to September 11th. There's no charge. You don't have to have symptoms. You simply need to, I do believe you need to make an appointment or pre-register, and you can be tested. So, there are some differences in approach, but I think under the circumstances, we're just trying to do what we can to try to both halt and make individuals and passengers feel comfortable traveling again.
Thank you. I've had a question from Simon McFadden, and really for you, Vivica. To what extent is Atlanta adopting technology to monitor, the ebbs and flows of people to ensure that there's separation and avoid bottlenecks, that sort of thing?
Technology. Now that's a good question. I do know, obviously, that we have some non-technological approaches with, the floor markings, and those sorts of things. Honestly, I will need to check on that. I do know that in terms of creating these reports, there has to be some kind of a reporting mechanism that I'm not aware of, that probably involves some level of technology, but I'll need to check on that. That's a really interesting question.
Okay, sure.
Peter, are you aware of any, Peter, around the nation?
I am not yet. I mean, I think it's a very hot topic right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would anticipate there's something. I mean, the airports use technology to monitor how often the restrooms need to be clean. So, but I guess the problem, well, one of the problems is to go back to this the point that Peter made, is the enforcement.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the problem, Alan, is that the technology exists. What do we do with it? So let me give you an example of an airport that I won't mention because this is confidential, but they were thinking of doing temperature screening for every person entering the terminal. Great idea. And then the technology is pretty rudimentary, but it's helpful. What do they do if a person comes through the screening checkpoint and they are showing a temperature? Well, it turns out there's nothing the airport can do with passengers. All they can do is turn to the airline and say, we've identified somebody with a fever, would you like them to fly? Meanwhile, that person has walked through the terminal, walked through the checkpoint, gone back to the airline ticket counter or to the office, and there's nothing they can do. And so a lot of airports have talked about these technological fixes and even implemented them on a pilot basis. Los Angeles and Seattle have both implemented technology fixes on a pilot basis, but they both abandoned them because of that enforcement problem.
And then there are the HIPAA considerations, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Under U.S. law, the privacy of health data and the privacy of personal information is a serious issue, and airports very much do not want to be in the possession of personal health data because of the statutes that govern how that data must be protected and how it must be kept confidential.
Difficult, very difficult. Well, thank you. I don't have any more questions that have come in, so that was absolutely superb. Thank you both of you. That was really, really jolly good and very clear. So thanks very much, and thank you, of course, to everybody for joining, and to those who submitted questions. Really good and most appreciated. So thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Alan, and thank you, Diego, for inviting us. It was a pleasure, and look forward to seeing all of the WALA members in person before too long.
That is exactly right. Thank you so much for having me. It was my first opportunity to address the WALA community. Peter, thank you for considering me. Diego, Alan, thank you. I see some familiar faces. Well, I see some familiar names like Ms. Giddens I see there. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you.
And thank you to you. Once again, we have a very fantastic webinar. Congratulations to you. Thank you, Alan, for moderating again. And I'm really happy to lead this amazing organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Gustavo, as well, of course.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Let's go.